In 1975, a groundbreaking book introduced some new concepts, like speciesism, like racism and sexism, only with an oppression that was broader and encompassed all animals. And so amid calls for black liberation and women's liberation, why not animal liberation? Philosopher Peter Singer asked the question, wrote the book. It spawned animal rights. Peter Singer is next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. On today's episode, philosopher Peter Singer. His book, Animal Liberation, in 1975, changed how people saw animals in society by arguing that if animals could feel pain, they had a right to live life free from suffering. Singer is now preparing a new edition of Animal Liberation, which will assess how his thinking and society has evolved. But his main point remains the same: the need to end speciesism, the tyranny of human over non-human animals. Singer likes to point out it's no different than the tyranny of sexism or racism, and in many ways, it's no better now than in 1975. Here's my conversation with animal liberation author Peter Singer on the PETA Podcast. You mark differences with each introduction, and it's always like it's a little furthering of a little lessening of this, a little more of that. You mentioned some of the artificial fake meats that are out there now. How do you view how it's been since you first authored Animal Liberation?
In my view, our attitudes to animals has definitely improved. Animals have moved from the very far margins of our concerns to being a little closer in, not at the center, but still closer in. We have, when I say we, I mean in, I suppose I'm thinking of in the Western world generally, there are improvements in some of the ways in which animals are treated. For example, and this is a good thing, in looking at experiments that are going on now for the new edition that I'm preparing, I can't find examples quite as blatantly cruel or inflicting the suffering as intense as I had in the 1975 original edition. So yes, there's been some improvements, but against that, you have to balance the fact that there are far more animals suffering in factory farms now than there were before, and that's largely because of the increasing prosperity of parts of the world, such as China and other East Asian countries in particular, and to some extent India too. And people in these countries, as they become more prosperous, they tend to eat more meat, and therefore there are more animals in factory farms. So I wish I could say there's less animal suffering in the world now than there was in 1975, but that would just be false. I think there's clearly more animal suffering just because there are so many more animals in factory farms. And in some of these countries, again, China is an example, there is really no national animal welfare law to protect animals in farming conditions.
Are we further along than you thought in 1975 that where we would be, or do you think we're just kind of treading water still in a relative sense? More people, more suffering, not as far along as you'd hope. How would you assess where we are now?
I don't think we're treading water, because I think things have changed. And some things have changed for the better and some things have changed for the worse. If you'd asked me in 1975, I would have said, look, I hope that by 2020, people will have realized that animals are sentient beings with lives of their own to lead, and we shouldn't be thinking of them just as means to our ends. And therefore, for example, most people will have stopped eating them or stopped eating commercially reared animals. Of course, that hasn't happened. So to that extent, I'm disappointed. We haven't gone where I'd hoped. But on the other hand, as I say, some of the things that I did describe in the 1975 edition, including some absolutely awful experiments in which dogs were subjected to inescapable electric shock until they collapsed and ceased to try to escape it because they just couldn't, and would give up and lie there accepting repeated electric shocks. I don't think that's going to be done and published in a scientific journal today. Also, some of the worst forms of confinement of animals in factory farms, like individual crates for veal calves and for breeding sows, and the very small and very crowded cage for egg-laying hens, are prohibited in significant parts of the world. So across the entire European Union, some 27 nations, 450 million people, and the UK, which is no longer in the European Union, but still complies with the same laws on animal welfare, and parts of the US, particularly California. So definitely there have been signs of progress. They're not universal, unfortunately.
So the progress is there. When you wrote the book in 75, did you think that your book, Animal Liberation, would be received in the way that it has? Because in some respects, not only are you the author of Animal Liberation, but how does it feel to have birthed this book and essentially the movement as well?
Well, I'm obviously, very pleased that there is a movement. I'm very pleased that the book helped to inspire that. I wouldn't say I was the only one, but probably I was the one who did most to put these ideas into the mainstream and into the media and to provide a philosophically rigorous account of why animals matter and why the way we're treating them is indefensible. I mean, it would have been terrible if that had had no impact at all. So I'm glad it's had an impact. And I did think, I told you before, and I was hopeful that maybe people would really change fundamentally and stop eating animals. But I also sometimes thought, here I am coming out against such huge interest groups, the entire farming, agribusiness industry, the scientists performing research on animals. What hope do I have? I'm going to publish this and it's going to basically disappear. So that hasn't happened either. The book has been continuously in print for 46 years now, which is pretty unusual for books. All of that is of course pleasing, but I do want a lot more change.
Well, one of the concepts that your book introduced, and it's really the anchor of animal liberation, it's the idea of speciesism. You still kind of apologize for the awkwardness of the word somewhat, but it does describe what it is that must be eradicated and is really the basis of, animal liberation. Here's what is your feeling about the idea of speciesism today? Is there how much? I guess we have a lot further to go for it to have the kind of impact that it needs, right?
Absolutely. We are still speciesist. Most people are still speciesist. Society functions on the basis of speciesism in regard to animals. Otherwise, we couldn't be rearing them and killing them and eating them in the way that we are on such a vast scale. And I think that eating of them is kind of at the heart of our speciesism. I imagine that if we stopped eating them, we might find it more possible to really move away from speciesism, although there would still be other conflict areas, including the use of animals for research, of course. So we haven't got rid of that. But the concept serves a function, though, in that it makes this analogy with some of these other isms that, again, although we haven't moved past in practice, we reject in theory, or most people, in theory, reject racism and sexism too. So it's making those comparisons and therefore alerting people to think in a different way about animals and about how we might relate to them if we didn't think that because they're not members of our species, they don't really count, or they don't really count in the way members of our species do count.
Yeah. I mean, one of the ideas about speciesism is it challenges people to go beyond merely being kind. You recognize that the animals have their own interests and have their inherent rights. And that's usually where people start, getting their dander up and say, okay, let's go at it, Professor. But this is what you write. You say, this book is about the tyranny of human over non-human animals. This tyranny has caused, and today is still causing, an amount of pain and suffering that can only be compared with that which resulted from the centuries of tyranny by white humans over black humans. The struggle against this tyranny is a struggle as important as any of the moral and social issues that have been fought over in recent years. Now, you mentioned racism and sexism, but now you're bringing it, you're putting it in people's faces here now. You say this is, the tyranny of white humans over black humans. Do you think there's been an acceptance of that, or has that been the central resistance of people's acceptance of speciesism?
So I wouldn't say that there's been a general acceptance of that. Obviously, there are parts of the animal movement that do accept that. And actually, it was nice to see that Yuval Harari, who's the author of the best-selling book Sapiens, A History of Our Species, does agree with that and actually says, and he wrote an introduction to one of the editions. I don't know if you saw that one, the Bodley Head edition published in the UK. He wrote an introduction in which he says that the treatment of animals by humans may be the greatest crime that humans have committed throughout the history of our species. So, here's somebody who I didn't know at all had an interest in animals until I saw him write that, saying this. So there is somewhat more acceptance of this idea than there used to be.
Yeah.
And I think if you look at the amount, we're just talking about quantities of pain and suffering here.
Mm-hmm.
And the numbers are so vast, something like 70 billion animals, like about 10 times the entire world's population, raised and killed for food each year, often in conditions that cause an immense amount of pain and suffering to them. Then I think, that statement is probably true. So I hope that more people will accept it and will recognize that this is a very major issue, that if we want to reduce pain and suffering in the world, starting with what we're doing to animals is a very good way of doing it.
Right. Well, let me go on to something else that you wrote, connected to that. You write, the core of this book is the claim that to discriminate against beings solely on account of their species is a form of prejudice, immoral and indefensible, in the same way that discrimination on the basis of race is immoral and indefensible. I mean, that's pretty clear. That's something that might be startling to some people, not to others who are ready to take that leap. But there are some who say, what? Right? They're saying, this can't be. You can't be talking about slavery. You can't be talking about racism. But you continue. Greatly as I admire those who have eliminated speciesism from their lives purely because their sympathetic concern for others reaches out to all sentient creatures, I do not think that an appeal to sympathy and good-heartedness alone will convince most people of the wrongness of speciesism. So throughout this book, I have relied on rational arguments. Unless you can refute the central argument of this book, you must now recognize that speciesism is wrong, and that if you take morally seriously, you must try to eliminate speciesist practices from your own life and oppose them elsewhere. Otherwise, no basis remains from which you can, without hypocrisy, criticize racism or sexism. And I bring this up again because it really becomes the thing that if you cannot accept, this, then how can you not appear hypocritical when you are, say, you're anti-racist or you're anti-sexist? You must embrace the animals.
I think that that's right. And of course, that is an argument that I suppose has not yet been accepted. But I am trying to put, as I say, a rational argument out there. And that's because, of course, my background is in philosophy, and philosophy deals in rational arguments. But it's also because I think if we just go by people's sentiment and their sympathy, you don't get the result that I want. What you get is that people are appalled by the treatment of dogs, let's say, and the fact that in some parts of the world people eat dogs and treat them very badly before they kill them and eat them. But these same people who are appalled by that are not at all appalled by the treatment of pigs, which might be just as bad and is on a vastly larger scale in the factory farms of the United States and pretty much everywhere else. Or you get people who will be outraged by the killing of the shooting of a lion, or an image of somebody killing a seal on the ice, but they're not at all troubled by people killing other animals that they don't feel are as attractive. And I wanted to move beyond that, and I think the argument is a rational one, and I still think that it's difficult to reject racism and sexism and still defend speciesism. Just say, yeah, somehow, one way of drawing the line around our race or our sex is wrong, but the other way of drawing the line around our species, that's fine. I don't think that cuts it, really.
But really, if you get people to accept that, then the game is over. Then animal liberation has won, right? I mean, that's the high mountain that we climb.
Yes, you're right. And that's why I'm trying to get people to accept that. And I admit that I have not succeeded in getting the majority of people to accept that, so we haven't got to the peak of the mountain, and we may still be a while before we get there. I accept that.
Well, take us through the thought processes. The early chapters, you bring up other philosophers like Bentham and Hume, and you bring up this idea of suffering, and suffering meaning also the possession of a central nervous system. These are things that animals experience. They suffer, they have central nervous systems, and then, but essentially you're saying, are they equal to humans? Is that enough to make them equal to humans?
I want to be a little more careful about this statement that they're equal to humans. What I say is that we should not discount their pain and suffering because of the fact that they're not members of our species. If we have roughly similar amounts of pain and suffering, it's just as bad whether that happens to a fellow human or to a cow or a pig or a dog or a rat or a mouse. The suffering is just as bad. I'm not saying, of course, that animals and humans are equal in having the same capacities to suffer. We may suffer because we, know that we have to do something unpleasant next week, or, because we're anxious about not passing an exam, or a whole lot of reasons for suffering that make no sense for non-human animals. And some of them may suffer also in different ways because of their having more acute senses in various ways that they have evolved to survive. So there are differences, but I'm a little wary of saying, just a general statement like the animals are equal of humans. What I'm saying is we should give equal consideration to their interests where their interests are similar to ours, where they have comparable interest in not feeling pain or not suffering or enjoying their life. That's the kind of equality that I'm looking for.
Right, because a lot of people who are opposed to you would say, oh, we're not equal. I'm more, I'm worth more than my dog, or, they'll come up with something like that. So it's not a perfect equality in that sense, but it's what, capacity to feel pain?
Where beings have a capacity to feel pain, then the pain matters, and how much it matters does not depend on the species of the being. It may depend on to what extent they feel pain, what they are feeling, and sometimes that's rather hard to know. But you said earlier, well, animals have central nervous systems and so on. Well, not all animals do. And
Right.
in fact, I think where animals don't, like if we're talking about an oyster, I think it's very unlikely that an oyster can feel pain. It doesn't really have a central nervous system and a brain in the way we do. So in that sense, you could say, well, animal liberation is not for all animals, because if it's true that oysters can't feel pain, then it doesn't make sense to say we should give equal consideration to their pain because they just don't have any. In that sense, they're more like a plant. So, it's a matter of looking at every different species of animal and saying, what can they feel pain? What do we think that causes them to feel pain? What are their mental states? But I do think that whenever animals have a capacity for suffering and pain, then that's something that needs to be considered, and considered for what it is, not discounted because they're not humans.
And then who becomes the arbiter? I guess humans are the arbiter, right, of who gets rights or who gets some kind of deferral or who gets some special status?
Yes, I mean, there is no one else who can be the arbiter. We don't have any kind of objective scorecard that suddenly appears in the sky and says, animals feel this amount of pain, or these species feel pain and these ones feel more. We have to try to work that out as best we can, and I hope as objectively as we can. But I acknowledge that we don't have a really accurate way of knowing what animals feel, but we don't really have an accurate way of knowing what our fellow humans feel. No doubt some people feel things more sharply, more acutely than others. I suppose we basically ignore that. We just count them all equally because we can't measure it.
Well, how about the idea of rights? Because now this goes into the idea of rights, and you say it goes beyond just mere kindness or being kind to the animals. I mean, we don't speak about or talk about kindness to minorities or to women when we talk about their rights. And yet, sometimes kindness enters into the picture for animals. What gives them a kind of status where we can confer rights to animals?
What gives them that status is that they can feel things, that their lives can go well or badly, that they can experience pleasure or pain. And then we give them rights in the sense that we recognize that there are certain ways of treating them that are wrong, and we have either social norms or we have laws or regulations which may mean that it's wrong to do certain things to them, which prevent us doing certain things, or should. So that's really all I mean by rights. I'm not a kind of rights fundamentalist. I don't think you start from the idea of a being has rights and that's the moral foundation. I think you start from the idea that beings can have lives that can go well or badly for them, that they can, as I say, suffer or be happy or feel pleasure or feel pain. And then you try to set up a system that will reduce the amount of suffering and pain that we inflict on them and give them better lives. And so you derive rights from that.
Now, I'm sure that you have other philosophers and other critical thinkers, academics and whatnot, scholars who will read your work and they want to come at you. They want to go at you and say and take it apart. What is that you're lying to them that puts them in their place and that makes them just step back a bit and maybe with an open mind look at this idea or the concept of animal liberation?
Well, it's interesting that over the years, I think there's been much more acceptance of the idea that animals can't, that they have a central place in morality, that the way we treat them, or at least some of the ways we treat them, is wrong. There have been many more philosophers who've come to accept that. Some of them have been people who've been directly part of the animal rights or animal liberation movement. Obviously, say Tom Regan, who wrote The Case for Animal Rights and several other books, is a good example. We sadly lost him a couple of years ago, but it's been interesting that people from other traditions as well have come to this view. So a relatively recent example is Christine Korsgaard, who's a professor of philosophy at Harvard and probably the leading follower of the Kantian tradition in ethics. That is the tradition that goes back to Immanuel Kant, the late 18th century German philosopher. And Kant himself had no space for animals. Kant himself says basically, because animals are not autonomous and self-conscious, we don't have any duties to them. So, the only reason that it's wrong to be cruel to an animal, according to Kant, is that then you might develop a cruel disposition and you might be cruel to humans. The same thing that Thomas Aquinas said, incidentally, 500 years earlier. But Christine Korsgaard, although a Kantian, and generally therefore in agreement with Kant's approach, says that Kant made a big mistake here, that he basically went from the idea that you can't be a moral agent unless you're a self-aware, autonomous being, to the idea that you can't be what we might call a moral patient, that is, the subject of moral duties, if you're not autonomous and rational. And Korsgaard points out that just doesn't follow. And of course, when you look at it, we don't think that follows in the case of fellow humans either. Small children are not moral agents, but we certainly think that we have duties not to harm them. So, why should the fact that animals are not moral agents mean that we don't have any duties against harming them?
So from the beginning of writing this and getting the kind of opposition to your book, you found philosophers especially coming more toward you.
Yes, not all of them, but I think it's an increasing trend, and I think particularly younger philosophers who've developed since animal liberation was out there and since this debate was out there, a lot of them do now accept at least a large part of this approach, and that's certainly been encouraging. And the other thing is that it is now a central part of courses on practical or applied ethics. It's always getting into those courses, whereas previously people would have ignored it. People would have said, no, the important issues are all issues about the treatment of humans, and would have left animals out of the picture altogether.
Well, now it seems that we're all kind of interrelated, that you've got to think about the animals. You've got to think about yourself, as, eating animals can cause harm to your health. And so people have turned to veganism. Using animals in a way through factory farming can destroy the environment. So the interrelation of all these things connected to our use of animals in this bad way, how is that a factor in maybe changing or liberating animals from the kind of tyranny that they experience now?
So I think that these things do have an impact. All of these different factors, and you mentioned the rise in people avoiding animal products altogether, being vegan, having a plant-based diet. Some of that certainly comes from the animal movement. A lot of it also comes from concern about climate change and the recognition that eating animals makes a major contribution to your carbon footprint, that going vegan will reduce that significantly. And also there's a lot of local pollution from factory farms, pollution of rivers, and so on. So that comes together. And I am hopeful that the next sort of big step forward will be the shift away from meat, either to plant-based meat-like products, which of course we already have on the market, like the Impossible Burger and Beyond Meat, or possibly to cellular meat. And just in January of this year, Singapore became the first country to permit the sale of meat that never came from a whole animal, but was grown from cells at a cellular level. In the case of what Singapore approved was cellular chicken, and although that exists, it's not yet competitive in price with kind of meat that you can buy that comes from an animal. But I'm hopeful that that price will come down, and that will then have a big impact in shifting people away from meat, which would have two effects. Most directly, it would reduce the amount of animal suffering in factory farms in particular, and also correspondingly the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. But I think it would also help people to look more objectively at animals, and would make it easier for them to accept the ethical arguments that I and others have been putting forward. If you think to yourself, gee, if I accept that argument, I'm going to have to stop eating some of the foods that I've been eating all my life and that I enjoy eating, and I don't know what else I would eat. That creates a powerful barrier to accepting the argument. I think if people were perfectly rational, it wouldn't, but we're not perfectly rational. So if people start eating these other products, and then they can look more objectively at these arguments, I think that could make a big difference.
Well, one of the things that you just point out is that the biggest argument is, well, this is the way it's always been done. This is what I know. This is what we do. And end of argument. They don't go further to clash with your major points. They just say, this is what we've always done. That must be frustrating for you.
Yeah, it's very frustrating. And of course, it's a terrible argument, because the same arguments, were used to continue to have men dominant over women. That's the way society has always been organized. People would appeal to religion, and some remarks in the Bible about suggesting that men are dominant. It's a terrible argument, but it does seem to be an argument that is powerful for people. They find it hard to imagine changing things that they've grown up with, and that they know that their parents and grandparents grew up with, and to acknowledge that this is wrong and that needs to change. That's a big shift.
But the other drive could be just capitalism grows up and gets a sense of wisdom and a sense of morality, which is people make money on not killing, not torturing, not being unkind to animals.
I think a lot of your listeners will think that it's wishful thinking to believe that capitalism itself will grow up and get morality. And some people do say to me, look, capitalism is the root of the problem, and unless you overthrow capitalism, you're not going to change this. I think both of those views are actually wrong. I think capitalism is morally neutral in itself, because it responds to what people buy. Capitalism requires consumers to buy its products. Otherwise, obviously, a business that makes products that nobody wants to buy in a capitalist society goes bankrupt. We really need to get the consumers demanding different products, and saying, for example, look, if I can get something that tastes like meat and cooks like meat, and I can make my traditional meals with it, but it's plant-based or it's cellular-based, and there was never an animal who suffered because of it, then if people will then buy that, then capitalism will start to provide it, and capitalism will then gear up to manufacture this product. There will be market competition to make it as good as possible and as cheap as possible, and I think it will spread.
Well, that's all I meant. The end of animal suffering, if the money is followed and the capitalists find that on the demand side, they can make money on veganism, make money on anti-suffering, maybe that's the outlying hope. I mean, it would be better if you had victory on the treating animals is akin to the discrimination toward dark-skinned people and racism, that kind of discrimination. I think that's the high peak we want to climb. But really, any entree to the truth or any entree to the goal is welcome. What do you see as the most likely, and what are you saying in your new edition about maybe the next 45 years?
Yeah, well, I'm still just drawing together the research for the new edition, so I can't exactly tell you what my conclusions will be. But I do think that there will be two avenues for change. I still think that ethical arguments can persuade people. In fact, I recently did with a couple of colleagues a controlled study of students at a major American university some of whom took a course on animal ethics and some of whom didn't, but otherwise they were kind of randomly assigned to these different classes. And there was a drop in meat consumption among those who took the course in animal ethics, not a huge drop, but a statistically significant drop. So I think that arguments do make a difference, but I certainly think we will need to draw on changes in what the market produces in order to really make the large-scale difference that I'm hoping we will make.
There are two areas in the current edition, or the edition that exists now. You talk about vivisection and experimentation, and you talk about factory farmers. So you talk about the consumption, factory farms. You talk about the mistreatment of animals in the vivisection side. Talk about those two areas, and where is the future for those two areas?
Yeah, they're very different. I think that the factory farming issue is the bigger and more important one, because the numbers just are so huge. They, as I said, if we're talking just about land-based vertebrate animals, we're talking about over 70 billion animals. If we're talking about animals used in laboratories, we're maybe talking about 200 million animals. Most of the estimates don't go any higher than that, between 1 and 200 million. That's a lot of animals, but 100 million compared to 70 billion, that's 700 times as many animals, 700 animals in factory farms for every one animal in a laboratory. And I don't think the suffering in factory farms is any less. It's certainly more prolonged, and for most animals, it's probably worse, because essentially these animals, they aren't worth very much. You've got to produce them cheaply. You don't care about them as individuals. So I think in that area, as we've been saying, we have to try to provide alternatives that people want to buy and want to eat, and then maybe we can shrink that down. And while we're talking about animals for food, I will talk more in this new edition about fish, because I think in 1975 I was still a little hesitant to talk about fish. It was going to be difficult enough to get people to worry about cows and pigs and chickens, and fish, living in an element that we don't actually inhabit, not being able to show their suffering through facial expressions or through emitting vocalizations, noises that we can hear, being kind of cold and slimy. People seem to have so little empathy that I didn't really want to say much about that. But I think now some of the animal organizations are doing more to arouse concern about fish, and the numbers, again, are even far larger than the numbers of vertebrate land animals. Estimates of the number of fish killed by humans each year go over 1 trillion, over 1,000 billion, in other words. So I will say more about that. I think that's a big issue that needs more attention.
How about, are we fishing ourselves or fishing the fish out of existence? Is that an issue too?
That's definitely an issue, yes. With many species, they are being overfished, and fish stocks have declined, or in some cases, commercial fishing is no longer really possible because the stocks have dropped so low. That's a difficult issue to change, because the oceans are a commons. Once you get outside the coastal zones of different countries, then anyone can fish there, and it's very hard to enforce in any way, codes about how fishing should be conducted or how stocks should be protected. It would take a very educated consumer populace to really pay attention to sustainable fishing labels. So again, I think the big hope is to try to develop cellular-based fish, and there are companies that are working on that. So And for at least some kinds of fish, the sort of fish fillet kind of fish,
Right.
I think this is going to be quite possible that we will be able to produce something that actually is fish at the cellular level, but didn't come out of the oceans.
This is all about having a taste for fish or taste for meat. What about what all these eating these animals do to the consumer, the human being? Could self-interest be a way out of this problem, knowing that what eating meat does for heart disease, what eating mercury in the fish supply, what that could do to human health? Is self-interest a factor in maybe leading us toward a moral ground?
It's a factor, but I don't. It's been those issues have been around for a long time, and I don't know that they've made a huge amount of progress in terms of getting into people's consciousness and persuading them to change what they eat. It's made some difference.
Diabetes, heart disease, I mean, that could change.
I know there's a lot of evidence, and there's a lot of good reports. The Lancet has come out with these series of reports about how both for human health and for the health of our planet and the climate, we need to dramatically reduce, in particular, our red meat consumption, but also reduce other animal product consumption to lower levels. And yeah, I think more doctors are aware of that. Maybe it's making some difference. But as I say, when you look at the figures on the amount of meat that people are eating, if there is a decline, and there is certainly a decline in red meat consumption in Western countries, but if there is a decline in that, then it gets offset by the growth in meat consumption in China and other Asian countries.
So we talked about the factory farms. What about vivisection? What is going to change how animals are treated there?
The automatic assumption on which the use of animals is based is that human interests trump the interests of non-human animals. And I don't think that that's how it should be. I think we need to give full weight to the interest of non-human animals. And if we did, then a lot of the research that is done now would not be done.
Well, one of the things during this COVID period, the race for the vaccine, by skipping needless animal tests, the vaccines came out sooner. There were still some animal tests, but not nearly as many as would have been required in previous years, or in for other drugs and other instances. That's a plus. They were able to skip many experiments and get vaccine to market much sooner. Do you think that's going to have any kind of impact in your mind, or is this just a one-off?
It certainly should have an impact. You're quite right that in emergencies we do tend to skip some of the animal research, and in fact, in the case of the coronavirus pandemic, we had tens of thousands of volunteers, human volunteers, offering to take part in research to help develop a vaccine sooner, and developing the vaccine sooner without going through that animal route undoubtedly saved many human lives, because every day sooner that we get the vaccine, we have thousands fewer people dying. We are finding more alternatives that include the use of humans, and also, of course, include artificial intelligence, modeling compounds and working out in advance what is likely to have some prospect of helping us and what isn't. And there's also development of using cells, isolated cells, rather than whole animals. I think all of these things are making progress and reducing animal suffering. But there are other things where animals are continuing to be used, of course, and there's a lot of new areas of research that I guess can't really be done without animals. For example, gene research, trying to modify genes and seeing what that does. So I think there's still big problems in the animal research area, and will be for some time to come.
Now, this is a question that comes out of some things I've read in your book and some other books that you've written on animal rights. and it's about how you deflect criticism when people look at a typical look at an animal rights person. The first thing they do is, as you know, they look at your shoes. Are you wearing leather? Are you eating a burger? Are you eating? How do you view that? How do you, as a person who wrote Animal Liberation, how do you deflect that kind of criticism? How do you go after that?
Well, not wearing leather shoes is a start, obviously. And there's no need to wear the leather shoes at all. We have lots of good non-leather substances that we can make our shoes of. And I, you know, apart from the Impossible Burger, which I tried because it was a plant-based burger and I hadn't had a burger for decades. Well, I hadn't had a burger that tasted like a meat burger anyway. I guess I'd had lentil burgers and things of that sort. If you want a burger, you can always eat that. I actually decided this wasn't something that I really particularly needed to be eating anyway. I've got a lot of other, plant-based meals that I think are much more delicious than burgers anyway, and easy to make. So, yeah, I'd say two things about this. One is you try to basically have a lifestyle where your consumption does not harm animals, is not complicit in causing harm to animals. But the second thing is, I don't think you have to be absolutely pure in every respect. For me, this is not a religion. It's not like somebody who's keeping kosher or halal, and has to make sure that there's not the tiniest amount of whatever the prohibited substance is. Because my concern is, I don't want to give my support, my dollars, to animal abusing industries. And so that's why I'm not going to go to the supermarket and buy a chicken. But if somebody, if there's some tiny amount of something in that I've been eating and somebody says, oh, that had a bit of dairy in it or something like that, I'm not really troubled by that. These insignificant quantities, as I say, it's not a matter of personal purity. I don't think that sometimes putting the time into ensuring that what you're eating, especially if you're eating out and not, controlling yourself, what you're eating so well, I don't think putting the time into finding a place that will be 100% vegan is always worth it. Sometimes there are better things you could do with that time that might even do more to help animals or to help the world.
Well, I only bring it up because, all right, here I'm wearing a non-wool jacket. I'm wearing a polyester shirt. I've got non-leather shoes. I'm trying to be totally vegan, and everything that I may have overlooked in the past. I'd wear a wool suit. This is not wool. I'd wear a hair shirt. No, this is polyester. But the thing is that when you come up to these people and they say, oh, look at your shoes or whatever, they feel like they've won. They've exposed the hypocrisy and they've won the argument, which is not necessarily the case. Not when you can shoot back and say, well, are you against racism? Then how can you discriminate against animals in this way? That's a bigger hypocrisy, I suppose.
I think it's a much bigger issue, yes, than, whether somebody finds something that you're wearing that comes from an animal and wants to point the finger at you. Obviously, we're trying to produce a change. We're trying to produce a change where we won't be commercially exploiting animals. As I say, we don't want to be complicit in doing that as far as we can avoid it. But in a way, it's important to be active and concerned about this and to live your life in a way that is trying to reduce this suffering. And I'm not that worried about somebody finding that something that I do involves some animal product. I think that's, as you say, it's a kind of a way of trying to catch you out that really gets a bit silly when it's taken to an extreme.
So, when is your new edition expected out, and what would you like it to say or be for the next 45 years?
It may come out in the second half of 2022. Certainly won't be any earlier than that. I hope that it won't be needed for another 45 years, to be honest. I hope that what it will say is that many of these things are still happening. We've made some progress. We've gone backwards in some other respects. And that it will simply make the book continue to be relevant as long as we continue to be doing these things to animals, which, as I say, I hope that sometime within the next 20, 30 years, we'll stop doing.
Peter Singer, the author of Animal Liberation, thank you for being on the PETA Podcast.
Thank you very much, Emil. It's been good talking to you and talking to your listeners.
Peter Singer, author of Animal Liberation. He talked to us from Australia. And that's our show this time out. Thank you for listening. Contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or on amok.com, AMOK.com, or see my work at the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, AALDEF.org/blog. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts, where you can rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music is provided by Carbon Works. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.